Most people think inequality rises and falls with economic cycles. Good times lift everyone. Bad times hurt everyone. The system balances itself over generations. Thomas Piketty spent 30 years proving this story was a lie. The French economist did something no one had done before. He opened the dusty archives of 20 nations. He read through tax records dating back to the French Revolution. He tracked inheritance documents from 1807. He compiled estate valuations from the British Empire at its peak. He assembled income data from the birth of the American federal tax system in 1913. What he found buried in those ledgers changed the global conversation about money and power. The period your parents and grandparents experienced, the decades between 1950 and 1980, when a factory worker could buy a house and send kids to college, was not normal. It was the exception. The rule, documented across 3 centuries of data, was something darker. Wealth concentrates. It flows upward. And it stays there, passing from generation to generation, unless something catastrophic breaks the pattern. The relative equality of the mid-20th century did not emerge from enlightened policy or the natural evolution of markets. It emerged from destruction. 2 world wars, the Great Depression. These events incinerated inherited wealth across Europe and America. The rich lost their fortunes to bombs, hyperinflation, and collapsed markets. For one brief window, the playing field leveled. Now the window is closing. Piketty's formula is simple. When the return on capital exceeds the growth rate of the economy, wealth concentrates among those who already hold it. He expressed it as R mass G, the rate of return on capital versus the rate of economic growth. When R beats G, the rich get richer, not through work or innovation, but through the simple mathematics of compound interest on existing assets. This is not a theory. It is an observation drawn from 300 years of documentation. The wealthy do not create their dominance through superior effort. They engineer systems of extraction. They position themselves at bottlenecks where capital flows. They build infrastructure of inheritance, trusts, and asset protection. They become gatekeepers of opportunity for everyone else. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. Here is why Piketty's research affects your life today. The house you struggle to afford belonged to someone's inheritance portfolio before it hit the market. The salary you negotiate comes from a company where executives earn 350 times what workers earn, up from 20 times in 1965. The retirement you hope to fund competes against institutional investors managing dynastic wealth accumulated across 5 generations. You live inside the system Piketty documented. Understanding its architecture is the first step toward seeing your position within it. This is the story of how one economist forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth written in its own financial records. Thomas Piketty was born in 1971 in the Parisian suburb of Clichy. His parents were activists in a Trotskyist movement during the 1968 protests. They later moved to southern France to raise goats. Piketty grew up skeptical of pure ideology from any direction. He wanted data. At 22, he completed his doctorate in economics. His dissertation examined wealth redistribution theory. But something bothered him about the entire field. Economists debated inequality using models and assumptions. Few of them looked at the historical record with the rigor the subject demanded. Piketty decided to count the money himself. He started in the French National Archives. The Fiscal Records Division held inheritance tax declarations stretching back to 1807, when Napoleon implemented systematic estate documentation. These records showed exactly what each deceased person owned: real estate, financial assets, business holdings, personal property. The state recorded everything for taxation purposes. Piketty read through these declarations year by year. He built databases from handwritten ledgers. He tracked how fortunes passed between generations. He mapped wealth concentration across Parisian neighborhoods, arrondissement by arrondissement. The patterns were unmistakable. In 1810, the richest 10% of Parisians owned roughly 60% of all wealth. By 1910, after a century of industrialization and economic growth, the concentration had increased. The top 10% now controlled 90% of everything. A century of progress, no reduction in concentration. The opposite. Piketty expanded his research. He recruited collaborators in other countries. Emmanuel Sayas worked on American tax records from 1913 onward. Anthony Atkinson studied British estate duties dating from 1894. Gabriel Zuckman tracked offshore wealth and tax havens. Teams in Sweden, Germany, Japan, and other nations contributed their own archival research. The World Inequality Database emerged from this collaboration. It now holds data on income and wealth distribution across more than 100 countries, stretching back centuries where records permit. What Piketty and his collaborators assembled was unprecedented. Previous economists studied inequality through surveys and estimates. Piketty worked from primary sources: actual tax returns, actual estate valuations, actual inheritance transfers. The numbers told a story different from the one most economists believed. The standard narrative went like this: as economies develop, inequality first rises, then falls. This was the Kuznets curve. named after economist Simon Kuznets, who proposed it in 1955. Countries industrialize, creating temporary inequality. Then education spreads, workers gain skills, and the gap narrows naturally. Piketty's data demolished this comfortable story. The gap did not narrow naturally. It narrowed through violence. Wars destroyed capital. Inflation erased bond holdings. Property confiscations wiped out aristocratic fortunes. Progressive taxation, implemented to fund war efforts, redistributed what remained. When violence stopped, concentration resumed. From 1980 onward, as memories of destruction faded and tax policies loosened, the old patterns reappeared. By 2010, wealth concentration in the United States and Europe approached levels last seen before World War I. Piketty was documenting a return to the Belle Epoque. To understand where inequality goes, you must understand where it came from. The Belle Epoque stretched from roughly 1880 to 1914. The name means beautiful era in French. For the wealthy, it was. For everyone else, it was something different. Piketty's research into this period drew from sources beyond tax records. He used literature as documentary evidence. The novels of Honoré de Balzac and Jane Austen served as windows into the economic assumptions of their time. In Austen's world, characters constantly discuss income in terms of annual returns from capital. Mr. Darcy has £10,000 per year. This sum comes not from labor, but from land and investments generating reliable returns. The assumption embedded in every Austen novel is the same. Wealth produces income, labor produces survival. The gap between them determines your social position permanently. Balzac's France operated identically. His characters scheme to marry into wealth because building wealth through work is mathematically impossible. The returns on existing capital outpace any salary. A young lawyer might earn 5,000 francs annually through exhausting effort. A modest inheritance generates twice as much while its owner sleeps. These were not fictional exaggerations. Piketty's research into Parisian notarial archives confirmed the numbers. Marriage contracts from the period show detailed wealth calculations. Families negotiated dowries and inheritances with precision because everyone understood the math. Capital returns averaged 4 to 5% annually before 1914. Economic growth ran at 1 to 1.5%. The gap between R and G stretched 3 to 4 percentage points every year. Over a generation, the compounding effect was enormous. If your father left you 100,000 francs in 1880 and you earned 5% annually while the economy grew at 1%, your wealth doubled relative to national income in roughly 18 years. You did nothing. The math worked for you. If you started with nothing in 1880, your wages grew at roughly 1% per year, matching the economy. After 18 years, you remained proportionally where you started. This is the structural machinery Piketty exposed. The Belle Epoque was not a period of opportunity. It was a period of concentration through mathematical inevitability. British records tell the same story. The Inland Revenue Annual Reports from 1908 onward tracked estate valuations at death. The top 1% of British estates held 70% of all wealth. The top 10% held 90%. The bottom 50% owned almost nothing. American data from the early income tax era shows identical patterns. The first IRS statistics of income reports from 1916 revealed a nation where the top 1% captured nearly 20% of all income. Wealth concentration was even more extreme. This was the world Piketty documented as the baseline. This was normal capitalism operating without interference. This was where the system naturally led when left to its own devices. Then the world caught fire. Between 1914 and 1945, the Western world experienced the most dramatic wealth destruction in recorded history. Piketty tracks this period through the disappearance of capital. The capital-to-income ratio measures total national wealth relative to annual national income. In France and Britain before 1914, this ratio stood at roughly 700%. National wealth equaled 7 years of national income. Most of this wealth belonged to the top 10%. By 1950, the ratio had collapsed to roughly 200%. National wealth equaled only 2 years of national income. What happened in between erased centuries of accumulated fortunes? World War I destroyed physical capital directly. Factories, railroads, and real estate and combat zones were reduced to rubble. But physical destruction was secondary. Financial destruction was primary. Governments funded the war through debt and inflation. Bondholders, the backbone of Belle Epoque wealth, watched their assets evaporate. French inflation between 1914 and 1920 reduced the real value of franc-denominated bonds by 80%. German hyperinflation in 1923 eliminated bond wealth entirely. A government bond worth a house before 1914 would not buy a loaf of bread by 1924. The Russian Revolution demonstrated the ultimate wealth destruction scenario. Bolsheviks confiscated all private property. French and British investors held massive positions in Russian railways and government bonds. Those positions went to zero overnight. The League of Nations documented the losses in economic surveys. Billions in Western wealth disappeared into Soviet expropriation. The Great Depression continued the pattern. Stock market collapses between 1929 and 1932 eliminated equity wealth across America and Europe. Real estate values plummeted. Banks failed, taking deposits with them. The rich lost fortunes not through policy, but through systemic collapse. World War II completed the destruction. Physical devastation spread across Europe and Asia. Governments seized assets for war production. Taxation reached unprecedented levels. The United States imposed a top marginal income tax rate of 94% by 1944. Britain imposed similar rates. These were emergency measures to fund total war. But something unexpected happened after the emergency ended. The high taxes stayed. Between 1945 and 1980, Western democracies maintained steeply progressive taxation. Top marginal rates in the United States remained above 70% until 1981. Inheritance taxes claimed large shares of concentrated estates. Corporate taxes funded public investment in education and infrastructure. Piketty calls this period the Great Compression. The gap between rich and poor narrowed not through market forces, but through deliberate policy choices made possible by war as destruction of the old wealth order. The rich had lost their leverage. Their capital was gone. Their political influence, tied to their economic weight, diminished. Organized labor, strengthened by wartime production demands, gained bargaining power. Governments, having mobilized entire economies for war, retained the capacity to direct economic outcomes. The result was an anomaly. For roughly 35 years, R fell below G. Economic growth, fueled by reconstruction and technological advancement, ran at 3 to 4% annually. Capital returns, suppressed by taxation and regulation, dropped to 1 to 2% after taxes. A factory worker's wages grew faster than inherited wealth compounded. Upward mobility became real. The middle class expanded, home ownership spread. A generation believed this was how capitalism worked. Piketty's documentation reveals the truth. This was how capitalism worked after being blown apart by catastrophe. The destruction of accumulated wealth was the precondition for shared prosperity. The anomaly ended around 1980. Piketty tracks the turning point through multiple data series. Top income shares, top wealth shares, and capital-to-income ratios all begin climbing from this moment. In the United States, the top 1% income share fell from its Belle Epoque peak of roughly 20% in 1928 to approximately 8% by 1970. By 2010, it had climbed back to 20%. The compression reversed. Restoration began. What changed? The structural answer involves taxation. Top marginal rates fell from 70% in 1980 to 28%. By 1988, under Reagan, capital gains taxes dropped. Estate taxes shrank through exemptions and rate cuts. The machinery of progressive redistribution built during and after the wars was dismantled piece by piece. The ideological answer involves memory. By 1980, the generation who remembered the Belle Epoque was dead. The generation who fought in World War II was aging. New economists, raised in the Great Compression, theorized about markets as though the compression was natural rather than imposed. The Kuznets curve promised inequality would self-correct. Milton Friedman argued taxation distorted efficient markets. Arthur Laffer claimed lower rates would generate higher revenue. These theories emerged from economists who studied the compressed decades and extrapolated permanent laws from a temporary condition. Piketty's archive work revealed the extrapolation was backwards. The compressed decades were the exception. The concentrating decades, before 1914 and after 1980, were the rule. British data shows parallel patterns. The top 1% income share fell from 19% in 1918 to 6% by 1979. Margaret Thatcher's government began reducing top rates in 1979. By 2010, the top share had climbed back to 15%. French data tells a modified version. French taxation remained higher than Anglo-American levels. Concentration increased more slowly. The wealth tax on large fortunes, the impôt de solidarité sur la fortune, held back some accumulation. When Emmanuel Macron's government abolished this tax in 2017, concentration accelerated. The capital-to-income ratio tells the structural story most clearly. From its post-war low of roughly 200% in major economies, the ratio climbed steadily. By 2010, it reached 500 to 600% in most Western nations. Wealth again equaled 5 to 6 years of national income. The ratio was not yet back to Belle Epoque levels, but the trajectory was clear. Where does this wealth sit? Piketty and Zuckman documented the answer in their 2014 paper for the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Housing wealth grew enormously as a share of national capital. In many countries, housing appreciation alone explained most of the rising capital-to-income ratio. The implications are direct. If you own property you purchased decades ago, you participated in the restoration. Your home equity represents accumulated capital gains exceeding wage growth. You are on the winning side of REG. If you rent, or if you purchased recently at elevated prices with large mortgages, you are on the losing side. Your wages grow slowly. Your rent payments or mortgage interest flow to capital holders. The math works against you. This is not abstract theory. This is documented redistribution happening in the housing market you navigate daily. Piketty published his synthesis in 2013. The French edition of Capital in the 21st Century appeared first. The English translation followed in 2014 and became an unexpected phenomenon. A 700-page economics book filled with charts and historical data sold over 2 million copies worldwide. Why did a dense academic work reach a mass audience? The timing mattered. The 2008 financial crisis had shattered confidence in self-correcting markets. The recovery distributed its benefits unevenly. Stock markets recovered. Housing values in wealthy areas recovered. Wages stagnated. A generation of young adults faced diminished prospects compared to their parents. Piketty provided the explanation. He showed the pattern in the data. He gave a name to the dynamic, ROG. He documented centuries of evidence proving concentration was the default outcome. Critics emerged immediately. Gregory Mankiw, a Harvard economist who served in the George W. Bush administration, published Yes, R. Housing G. So what? In the American Economic Review. His argument, even if returns exceed growth, this does not automatically cause concentration. Rich families have many children who divide inheritances. Rich people consume their wealth. The math is more complicated than a simple formula suggests. Matthew Rognley, then a graduate student at MIT, published a critique in the Brookings Papers. He argued Piketty's data overstated returns on capital by including housing. Housing returns are not pure capital returns. They represent consumption value as much as investment income. Separate housing from financial capital, and the RIG dynamic weakens. Lawrence Summers, former Treasury Secretary, offered a different critique. He noted that capital markets are competitive. If capital becomes abundant relative to labor, returns on capital should fall. The R in RIG is not fixed. It responds to market conditions. Piketty's formula assumes stable returns, when history shows they fluctuate. Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson published The Rise and Decline of General Laws of Capitalism in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. They argued Piketty focused too narrowly on economics. Politics matters. Institutions matter. The same RIG dynamics produced different outcomes in different political systems. Piketty responded to critics in subsequent editions and follow-up work. His 2019 book, Capital and Ideology, expanded the analysis beyond economics into political and social structures that enable or constrain concentration. The debate continues in academic journals. But Piketty's core documentation remains largely undisputed. The historical data exists. The patterns are visible. The concentration happened, reversed, and resumed. The formula reduced complex history to essential dynamics. Returns on capital, growth of the economy. Which one wins determines who prospers. And right now, R is winning. COVID-19 provided the latest demonstration. Federal Reserve data tracked wealth changes during the pandemic and recovery. Between March 2020 and March 2021, American billionaire wealth increased by $1.5 trillion according to analysis by Americans for Tax Fairness using Forbes data. The bottom 50% of Americans held approximately $2.5 trillion in combined net worth during this same period. 30 billionaires controlled wealth equal to 165 million Americans. Asset prices drove this transfer. Stock markets surged on central bank support. Housing prices climbed as low interest rates fueled demand. Those who held assets before the crisis captured the gains. Those who did not fell further behind. Piketty's framework predicted exactly this outcome. When central banks inject liquidity to stabilize markets, the liquidity flows to asset holders. When interest rates fall, asset prices rise. When asset prices rise, those who hold assets grow wealthier. The policy response to crisis accelerated RRG. Current debates reference Piketty directly. Senator Elizabeth Warren's proposed 2% wealth tax cited his research. French debates over reinstating the wealth tax quoted his documentation. OECD reports on wealth taxation employ his methodology. The G7 and G20 discussions on minimum corporate taxation draw on his capital mobility research. Housing affordability has become the sharpest point of contact between Piketty's abstractions and lived experience. In major cities across the developed world, housing prices have risen faster than incomes for 4 decades. Buying a home now requires either inherited wealth, exceptional income, or accepting crushing debt loads. This is intergenerational wealth transfer operating through the housing market. Those whose parents bought property decades ago stand to inherit substantial assets. Those whose parents rented inherit nothing. The gap compounds across generations, exactly as the formula predicts. The question Piketty poses is uncomfortable. Can democratic societies reduce inequality through policy, or will it require another destructive crisis? The historical record offers limited encouragement. Progressive taxation worked during and after the World Wars, but the wars came first. The destruction of concentrated wealth created political conditions for redistribution. Taxation maintained what catastrophe initiated. No democracy has implemented successful large-scale redistribution during periods of peace and stability. The wealthy deploy their concentration into political influence. They fund campaigns, shape media, staff administrations, and structure tax codes to protect accumulated capital. The machinery of concentration includes political machinery. This is not conspiracy. This is documented in campaign finance records, lobbying disclosures, and regulatory capture studies. The data exists alongside Piketty's tax archives. What you do with this information depends on your position and your priorities. Understanding the system does not automatically provide escape routes. The mathematics of concentration operate whether you acknowledge them or not. But understanding the system does reveal one crucial fact. The economy you navigate is not neutral. It is not naturally balanced. It is not self-correcting toward fairness. It is a structure built by previous generations, operating according to rules written by those who benefited from writing them. Piketty did not invent this structure. He documented it. He opened 3 centuries of ledgers and showed you the entries. The Balzac characters scheming to marry into wealth understood their position in 1830. The Austen heroines calculating incomes from capital understood theirs in 1813. They knew the mathematics of their era. They planned accordingly. You now have the same documentation for your era. The archives are open. The data is public. The World Inequality Database is free to access. 300 years of records show where wealth flows. It flows upward. It compounds. It passes between generations. It concentrates unless something breaks the pattern. Wars broke the pattern in the 20th century. Piketty does not advocate war. He advocates wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, progressive income taxes, and global coordination to prevent capital flight. His policy prescriptions remain contested. His documentation does not. The numbers are in the ledgers. The tax returns are in the archives. The estate valuations are recorded. Thomas Piketty read them so you could understand what they mean. The question now is what you will do with this understanding in a world where R still beats G, where assets still compound faster than wages, and where the beautiful era of concentration has quietly returned while most people still believe the compression was permanent. The ledger is open. The entries are clear. The mathematics continue.